of some kind. The violence that took place in New York City earlier this week, and violence that took place at a Baptist church in Texas just this morning, which underlines the urgency, I think, of the work that we do and the reason why we are gathered here today. I want to particularly thank Sheikha Miriam Amir and Rabbi Sarah Weissman for being with us today as leaders in this conversation. We are honored by their presence and participation, and by the presence and participation of members of their respective communities. I also want to acknowledge that as we gather here today, we are very obviously doing so in a space that is dedicated to Christian worship. From the altar and the cross that are back there behind me to the banners that are hanging from the ceiling today from a special festival we had this morning, this is clearly a Christian space. And we appreciate that for some of you, entering a space like this might provoke a variety of feelings depending on your own personal history and the history of the communities to which you may belong. So I want to try to invite you to look past the Christian symbolism in this space as much as you can this afternoon, and to look at what to me is the more powerful symbol of this afternoon, which is the presence of all of you here, coming as you do from many different paths. So let us declare this space for this afternoon an interfaith space as much as we can. And please be assured that wherever you come from, whatever your tradition may be, this space this afternoon is a safe place for you. And Miriam and Sarah would like to add their own words about that today.
So much for having us today. Those of you who are part of Trinity Church, I can't tell you how much it means to the Muslim community for inviting us here and giving us a space to really connect to one another. And for every single one of you who have come in, whether you belong to a faith tradition or you don't, whatever you identify as, the fact that you've come willingly into this space to be a part of this conversation means so much to, I'm sure, any one of us in all of our congregations. So thank you for creating this type of safe space, because it's only with you that these types of spaces can take place. And whether they're in churches or in synagogues or in mosques or in the mall, when we're coming together with this hope of building these types of incredibly important relationships, we hope that with that community, we can carry this sort of love wherever we go. So thank you so much for creating this space and being a part of it.
I just want to echo that it's a delight to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I also want to echo that this is a safe space for learning, and that we can view this space, for those of us who are unfamiliar with this particular worship space, to really view it as a chance to open our minds and hearts to something new. So I just found out who William Wilberforce is from noticing the banner, and I encourage you all to treat it as an opportunity for learning. Thank you.
Thank you both. So I'd just like to say a few words about how we are going to proceed this afternoon. In a moment, each of the three of us will speak for a few minutes to open up this conversation. Our talks will be different. We have not shared with each other what it is we're going to say ahead of time. But those talks have been informed by a series of framing questions that we agreed on prior to this event and developed together. And after we have spoken, the remainder of our time is going to be used to take questions from all of you. Blank index cards will be found in the backs of the pew in front of you. And there are pencils also in each of those pews if you need them. There are additional blank cards in the back if you need them. And you may use those cards at any time you want to write a question that occurs to you, a question for all three of us or for any one of us. Steve and Glenn are going to be watching out for cards that are held up, and they will come and get those cards and those questions and bring them to Robin. And Robin Robin is in charge of discernment. So she's going to be looking at the questions to look for common themes and common questions, so that if we have 10 of the same sort of question, we can only ask that question one time, and that way we'll be able to get through as many questions as possible, since we probably don't have enough time to get through all of them. Rob will be passing those questions on to Reverend Elizabeth Riley, who is our associate here at Trinity and the head of our Hearts for Justice planning team, and she will be asking those questions to us on your behalf. And then when our time is concluded, we have an invitation for you, which we'll give at the end of the program to something that's going to be taking place in Trinity Hall after our talk today. I want to thank the members of our Hearts for Justice planning team who are listed in your program for all of their hard work in making this event possible, as well as to thank all of our volunteers who are helping us out today. Without their efforts, of course, we could not do this. So thanks to all of them, and thank you to all of you for being here this afternoon.
I would like to introduce our first speaker for today. Rabbi Sarah Weissman is the Associate Rabbi at Congregation Beth Am in Los Altos Hills, where she has served since 2008. Rabbi Sarah attended Amherst College in Massachusetts and graduated summa cum laude in 2003 with a degree in religion. In 2008, Rabbi Sarah was ordained at the New York campus of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. During her tenure at HUC, Rabbi Sarah served small congregations in the South. She also worked as a teaching and research assistant to Dr. Eugene Borowitz, one of the leading theologians of the Reform movement. In addition to her pastoral and pulpit duties, she oversees the adult education program and the Interfaith Outreach Committee at Beth Am. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Sarah.
Thank you so much. So we were invited to introduce ourselves in a sort of different way, which is to reflect on our names. And I just think this is very cool and I had a very interesting conversation with my dad about my name this week. So my name is Sarah Weissman, but when I was born, it was Sarah Wolf. And I was named after my great-grandmother. And so I had to remind myself a little bit about her biography. So it was a good opportunity to call my dad and say, tell me about Sarah Wolf. And unfortunately, she passed away when he was only 4, so he didn't know her very well. But what I do know is that she was born in Odessa, Ukraine, and she moved to the United States with her young family, including my grandfather, who was 2, in the 1920s. And by all accounts, she was very smart, very kind, very brave, and she was also a poet, which I didn't know. So I hope that I emulate some of those qualities, or I try to, and carry her name with me. I'm still Sarah Wolf Weissman, so it's still in there. So as I was introduced, I'm an associate rabbi at Congregation Beth Am, where I've been for almost 10 years. And the way I got there was that I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and my synagogue was my home away from home. It was a much smaller community than the one I serve now, but I spent many, many hours there as a child, being one of the very few kids who were there at Friday night services, running around in the back, up and down the stairs, and then later was part of the youth group and was a leader in the youth group, and also volunteered in the administrative office, which doesn't sound like very much fun, but I actually loved it. And it gave me a taste of what synagogues do day in and day out. And so it sort of sparked in me an interest in the rabbinate and becoming a rabbi. So when I got out of college, I entered rabbinical school. And it really felt like a way to help create communities like the one that I was brought up in and that meant so much to me as a child. It was a place where people really knew me, where adults other than my parents knew and cared about me and loved me. And there was such a formative experience that I carried it with me. And so now that really is how I see my work, is to create communities like the one that I grew up in, and in addition to help create spaces where people can explore their relationship with God and hopefully grow closer to God. I'm delighted to be here with you all, and I think the thing that really drew me to be part of this program, in addition to being invited, is that it's a very key point, is the chance to get to know different faith communities in our local community. Spend most of my working hours with Jews, which is a wonderful thing, but it's always nice to have some diversity and to get to know some other folks, and to have the chance to learn more about other faiths, and to notice that in the Bay Area, as people of faith, we are all sort of a religious minority, and so we ought to stick together, I think. So it's wonderful to be here. I've been asked to reflect on what I love most about my tradition, and I only have a few minutes, so I'm gonna focus and say that one of the things that really drew me to become a rabbi is the idea in Judaism that study of religious texts is a spiritual practice. Study is a spiritual practice, and as a self-professed nerd, this has always spoken to me. That Torah. When we speak about the Torah, we usually are referring to the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. But when we talk about Torah in a larger sense, we really are talking about the whole range of Jewish texts that have been written since the time of the Bible up till now. We never stop with just one book. There's always a commentary, an explanation, an addition, some kind of new interpretation that flows from our beginnings, 3,000 years ago to today. And I love that the stories and the laws and the debates and the proverbs and the poetry and the exegesis and the interpretation really continues through the generations, and that it's in many ways it's a conversation between Jews of different time periods. So I teach a Talmud class at Beth Am weekly, and the Talmud, for those of you who are not familiar, is the code of law and stories and debates that was written by Jews of Babylonia in around the year 500, collected over many generations and then codified. And it really is the highlight of my week to have this weekly conversation about this ancient text in which there's Rabbi so-and-so says this and Rabbi so-and-so says that. They never agree. And then we get to really debate it ourselves, and that we're part of that conversation. There's a famous teaching in the Talmud that says, "Turn it and turn it, for everything is in it." It is Torah. Reflect on it and grow old and gray with it. Don't turn from it, for nothing is better than it. And I really see that as a really precious part of Judaism, that we're constantly turning to our sacred texts and finding something new in them. And it's never boring. So, and another quote from my teacher, Rachel Adler, who said that Torah is not immutable, but it is inexhaustible. So as a Reformed Jew, we don't treat the Torah as literally true, but or perfect in a literal way, but it is inexhaustible. Another thing that I cherish about Judaism is our commitment to social justice, and I do see it as, and many Jews see it as, a core part of our identity. It goes back almost to the very beginnings of Judaism and to the notion of monotheism, a belief in one God. The idea that there's one God means that there's one standard of ethical behavior, and that one God commands us to behave ethically. So the pursuit of that ethical life and that ethical society really is at the core of Judaism. You may have heard a term called tikkun olam. Raise your hand if you've heard it. Tikkun olam. All right, a few people. This is a very central concept in Judaism, which is repair of the world. And we're seen as partners with God in perfecting the world, in making the world better. That is our task as human beings, and especially as the Jewish people.
Many of our texts, and not just mine, but I'm speaking about mine, so many of our texts are about pursuing justice in the sense of protecting the vulnerable, that is an essential part of what it means to be a Jew. So it's noted that 36 times in the Torah we are commanded not to oppress the stranger. And it often is explained by saying, "For you were strangers in the land of Egypt." So part of our identity as Jews is to remember the experience of being vulnerable, the experience of being other, and to use that for empathy, for protecting those that are vulnerable today. And that is a continuing challenge to both remember our own vulnerabilities, which we still have as Jews today, but not to let them make us insular or inward focused, but to use it as empathy and as a spur to us to protect those who are vulnerable. We have challenges, of course, and I think one of them, it really is that balance between focusing on the Jewish community, especially in times where it seems that we are feeling pressures or feeling vulnerable, and balancing caring for ourselves and caring for the Jewish community with our concern for the wider world. It's always a balancing act, and one that we continue to strive to figure out. I bring up the times where we feel vulnerable, and I think we are in one of those moments as American Jews. Historically, Jews have been treated pretty darn well in this country, and yet, in light of recent days and months, in light of the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in this country, I saw one statistic, which don't quote me on this because I think I saw it on Facebook, but I saw one that said that the rise of anti-Semitic incidents it's at 67%. It's risen 67% in the last year or two, which is shocking. And we might feel that we're sort of in our safe little bubble here in the Bay Area, but there have been anti-Semitic attacks and incidents and threats in our own communities. I won't give you a list, but you probably have heard of at least a couple of them. And so in these times when we are sort of, our protective bubble is pierced a little bit, I will share that Jews, even American Jews who feel pretty well assimilated, pretty well integrated, and pretty successful in this country, that we're still scared. And I think that's unfortunately another core part of what it means to be Jewish, which is that sense that can be taken to extremes, but that sense that no matter how accepted we feel we are, no matter how well we're doing in a particular country, that the other shoe can drop. And so I think it's really difficult not to panic and not to think, another Holocaust is coming. But those thoughts come to, I think, many, if not all of us, even young Jews who have no historical, memory of the Holocaust, whose families, were enough removed where the generations, we may not know Holocaust survivors. But there is that sense that to be a Jew means to be vulnerable and to always be on guard against a certain danger. And so in this moment, I think many Jews who thought that we were over that have realized we're not. And so again, our challenge is to keep that fear and that sense of vulnerability in perspective, and not to let it control us and not to let it dictate what we do, but also to help us to remain vigilant for our own safety and our own communities, and also to notice that it's never just the Jewish community that faces these challenges, that there are other minority groups that are facing similar and far worse, in many cases, far worse oppression or threat. And so I see this moment as a time to be a little bit afraid, but also to look outward. It is our feeling of, it's sort of natural to look inward, but this is a moment for us as a Jewish community to look outward and to say, how can we stand up for those who are in danger? And so I think that as a community and as communities of faith, we have an opportunity in this moment, which is, number one, to stand up for other communities of faith that are being attacked or being threatened in some way, to treat their sense of vulnerability as our own, and to stand up publicly and loudly and frequently to say that attacks on other faith communities is an attack on our faith, because our faith teaches us to protect every human life, to protect every human community, and to see that as our mission. And the other opportunity we have is that in this country, the loudest voices are often, that represent religion, are often voices of intolerance. And so as people of faith, we have to make our voices just as loud as, and with a message of faith, that what our faith traditions, what all of our faith traditions aspire to is really very similar, that we all, as people of faith, strive to create a world of equality and love and justice, and that our faith really drives us in that work. So again, I want to thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next speaker is the Reverend Matthew Dutton-Gillett. He serves as the rector here at Trinity Church in Menlo Park and has served as the rector since 2009. Reverend Matthew was raised in the United Church of Christ, where his father served as an ordained minister for more than 50 years. Matthew discovered the Episcopal Church while in college at Michigan State University and went on to attend the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he received his Master of Divinity. He has been an Episcopal priest for the past 25 years and has served congregations in Missouri, Illinois, and Tennessee before coming to California. While deeply rooted in the Christian tradition, Matthew is interested in the ways in which all religious traditions draw us into narratives and relationships that ultimately seek to transform us. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Matthew.
So, as Sarah mentioned, we agreed that we would talk about our names at the beginning of our talks today. And part of that was because we realized that each of our names has some significance within each of our respective religious traditions. When my parents gave me the name Matthew, I don't think they had any intention about its connection to Christian tradition, nor does anyone in my family bear that name before me. But beginning probably in my adolescence, when I discovered the meaning of my name, its connection to my Christian tradition has been important to me. But before I tell you what the name Matthew means, I want to speak about the name as it lands in the New Testament, in the Gospels. Matthew, the disciple Matthew, has a gospel named after him, which he probably did not write. But within the story of Jesus, he appears in all four of the Gospels, and he's identified by two of the worst adjectives that there are: tax collector and sinner. Tax collectors in the time of Jesus were particularly despised because they were seen as betrayers to their own people. They worked for the Roman Empire to collect taxes from the Jewish people, and in doing so, they were often abusive in their methods of collection and tended to collect more than they needed to and keep the additional amount for themselves. So to say that Matthew was a tax collector and a sinner is really to say the same thing, that he lived his life in a particularly unjust and immoral manner. And as the bearer of his name, I certainly don't take any pride in that. However, I find it to be a very powerful thing that despite his choices, Matthew gets counted among the inner circle of Jesus' disciples. And it seems at the moment that Matthew was invited by Jesus to be a disciple, he entered upon a path that transformed him completely. And the key to this transformation, it seems to me, was the fact that Matthew, having the status of an outsider among his own people because of the choices he made, was invited by Jesus to be an insider. Matthew would probably never have imagined himself worthy of such an invitation. And that invitation to be inside the life of Jesus and therefore inside the life of God sparked a transformation in him that led him to abandon his former life and embark on a life more in accord with God's dream for him. So Matthew was converted from being an unjust man to being a just man. He ended up living into the meaning of his name, which is gift of God. Jesus led Matthew to discover the gift of God that was in him and thereby enabled him to become a gift to others. And for me, my name has come to symbolize that possibility of transformation and the invitation to move away from injustice toward the justice of what Jesus called the kingdom of God. I'm reminded that God has given me the gift of this life, and I am meant to make the most of that life, both as a gift to God and to others. I don't claim to do that perfectly. The path of transformation is in many respects the journey of a lifetime. So given all of that, it is perhaps not surprising that I have come to see this business of transformation as being the essence of the Christian life and the Christian journey. As I came of age in the Christian tradition and began to explore the various aspects of it through my college years, I became interested in the way that Christian communities could function through their rituals and practices to help, or in some cases not to help, people experience that sort of inner transformation. I did not imagine that I would become a priest. Elizabeth mentioned that my father is a minister, and I was always quite sure growing up that I would never do that work. Never say never. But I was aiming for something quite different. I was aiming for a diplomatic career, an interest that was rooted in part by a deep desire to be part of building a more peaceful and more harmonious and more just world. Ultimately, however, particularly after an internship at the State Department in Washington, where I encountered extremely frustrated people, I came to believe that to have a truly peaceful and just world, we could not simply change the outward structures of the world's life. As many spiritual leaders of many traditions have noted, true peace has to begin inside ourselves. We cannot be at peace with each other until we have come to peace in our own souls and spirits, which means coming to peace with our relationship to the divine. So nurturing inner transformation seems to be what nurtures outer transformation. And so my focus shifted to that work of inner transformation, and out of that I was seized by a sense of being called into the priesthood. Well, there has been much joy for me on this journey of ministry. There has also been a great deal of heartbreak, particularly in the past few years. That heartbreak stems from the fact that while I see the heart of the Christian journey as being about this inner transformation that leads us deeper into the heart of God and therefore deeper into the heart of humanity, enabling us to work in the world in a transformed way, it is clear that this is not the vision which is held by all of my fellow Christians. Increasingly, it seems to me over the last few years, too many Christians have seen our tradition as being not about transforming lives in a Godward direction, but rather have seen it as a way of reinforcing a kind of tribalism that becomes identified with being an American, or being a white person, or being privileged, or being powerful, or even being a man. Christianity has become too often used as a tool of an increasingly extreme form of populism. And partly as a result of that, the public image of Christianity has become often one that I cannot identify with. I think this is true actually of a lot of Christians, more than we imagine, but too often those who have a different vision of the Christian tradition seem to have trouble claiming the microphone of the public media pulpit. And so there's a lack of awareness, I think, on the part of large segments of the public that there is a Christian vision that differs from that which the media tends to portray. It has also become clear to me over the past few years that Christianity has become implicated in an increasing suspicion of those who are religiously different, particularly Muslims and Jews. Christianity has become implicated in a simplistic, reactionary view of other religious traditions that seems unable to differentiate between what is a radical minority who use their religion as a political tool from a faithful majority who do not find their religion reflected in that radical agenda. And so Christians end up being implicated in a harmful stereotyping that has real and dangerous consequences for us all. None of this is consistent in my mind and in my experience with the authentic teaching of Jesus. And that's why I think gatherings like this are so important. In part, it's a way of inserting a different Christian voice into the midst of these dangerous and destructive narratives in order to oppose the implication of Christianity in the injustices perpetrated by those narratives. In part, it's an opportunity to make it clear to our Muslim and Jewish sisters and brothers that the sense of vulnerability that the last few years have impressed upon them is seen by at least some of us in the Christian tradition as unjust. And we recognize our need to speak and to act against it. And of course, it's an opportunity to hear authentic voices from other faith traditions, rather than the radical voices that are instilled through the lens of the media. But any interfaith gathering, I think, also raises a question that sometimes goes unspoken, so I'm going to speak it out loud today. It's a question that I can only frame from a Christian perspective, and that is, given the faith claims that Christianity makes, how do we receive the truth claims of other religious traditions? After all, many Christians would say, is not Christian truth somehow uniquely true compared to the truth claims of other traditions? These are questions that Christians have struggled with for centuries. And even in our most generous attempts to deal with those questions, we've had a very difficult time acknowledging the capacity of other religions to act as pathways of divine revelation. This is too big an area to address now. But I do want to suggest that we need to find ways of dealing with these questions in just ways. Because when you are unable to grant other religious traditions a share in God's truth on par with your own, it then becomes much easier to commit acts of violence against their followers. So for me, as I think about these kinds of questions, I come back to this matter of transformation. If we can move beyond theological differences between traditions and focus on meetings like this, where we actually encounter people of other traditions, we find, I think, that despite following different paths, we all seem to be being transformed in similar ways. The truth of the matter is that we find people of truth, beauty, faithfulness, and goodwill and justice in every tradition. We find people with a deep capacity for compassion in every tradition. We indeed find holy people in every tradition. And it is this, the impact that these different spiritual paths have on the lives of actual people who live them deeply and authentically, that is more powerful to me than any theological statement. It is perhaps when we meet at the human level, at the level of the heart, that we are able most to see the truth that is in each of us. It is there that we can tell each other our stories of how our paths have given us glimpses into the divine. and have opened us up to ways in which God seeks to transform each of us. We can share those stories without having to say that one of our stories is better than someone else's story. Jesus once said that you will know a tree according to the fruit it produces. The fruit that each of us produces is ultimately what bears the most powerful witness to the faithfulness of our lives. It's clear to me that this kind of meeting people at the level of the heart is exactly what Jesus did. And in doing so, he started people on the path of transformation. And the people that Jesus always engaged first were people like Matthew, those who through illness or circumstances or their own bad choices had become outcasts in some sense. He went to the most vulnerable of his time, to those who were considered unworthy or dangerous, and he invited them into God's love. He made outsiders into insiders, and he called the insiders to account for the ways in which they made others into victims. And to me, this is the basis of all Christian social action. This is where the call to justice becomes clear in the Christian tradition. There are many people in our world today who fall into the category of outcast in one way or another, who get labeled as unworthy or as dangerous or as other in some sinister sense. And it's clear to me from the teaching and example of Jesus that Christians are called upon to work to bring those outsiders into the inside of what he called the kingdom of God, which is just the Christian name for the universal idea that there is a state of being in which we can live in peace and harmony that has to be rooted in justice for all people. So everything that we do in church, the rituals and practices that lie at the heart of our tradition, are meant to renew in us this vision of the kingdom of God, to make this vision a part of us, and to empower us to be its agents in the world. To be agents of God's justice in the world is not easy work, and I will be the first to admit that as a matter of personality, I don't come to it easily. Kind of like Sarah, in that I'd like to just be in my office contemplating and studying things rather than out there demonstrating or something like that. But we were never promised that it would be easy. It's not a matter of doing what's easy, but of doing what is right and necessary and faithful. All religions have their own vocabulary for talking about building a world of peace. Sarah shared the vocabulary from her tradition with us. I don't think that it's important to get caught up in the differences in vocabulary. It's important to do the work together, to partner in bringing about this vision that goes by many different names, but whose goal is one. If religion is to be a force for good in the world today, we must work across different traditions for that to be so. If we look for opportunities to collaborate, we will find them. It is only when we don't look for them that we think collaboration is impossible. So I want to close with one of my favorite quotes that comes not from the Bible, but from one of the great saints whose name is not on any of these banners. Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote, "Christ has no body now on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which to look out and see Christ's compassion to the world. Yours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. Yours are the hands with which he is to bless people now." Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Sheikha Mariam Amir. She's an instructor at the Hikmah Institute. She received her master's in education from the University of California, Los Angeles, where her research focused on the effects of mentorship rooted in critical race theory for urban high school students of color. She holds a bachelor's degree in child and adolescent development from San Jose State University, where she served as the president of the Muslim Student Association for 2 consecutive years. Currently, she's pursuing a second bachelor's degree in Islamic Studies through Al-Azhar University's distance learning program. She has memorized the Holy Quran, has spent the past 12 years studying Islamic scholarship, and holds a second-degree black belt in the martial arts from Taekwondo. She writes for prominent Muslim sites, tours nationally and internationally, addressing communities on topics related to spirituality, social issues, and women's studies. Please join me in welcoming Sheikha Maryam Amir.
My name is Miriam. I'm named after Virgin Mary. In English, we say Mary. In Spanish, Maria. In Hebrew and in Arabic, Miriam. In French, Marie. There are so many different ways and so many different languages which celebrate this incredible individual. But growing up, born and raised in California, I was not connected to her in any way. I wasn't sure if I really wanted to be on any type of religious or spiritual path, because as a teen, the most important thing to me was to become the next Britney Spears. God bless her. So, as I'm going through this journey of trying to become popular and finding fame, my family takes a trip to Mecca. And I remember telling a friend of mine in high school that I didn't want to change. I was so afraid that I would go to this holy city and then I would become spiritual. When we went to Mecca, all my work of popularity would be God, please, spiritual people. Piety is not popular. We know that's not true. We are so popular and we're, Anyway, the point is that we go to Mecca. And going to Mecca was a turning point in my life because for the first time, I suddenly felt like God exists. And I wanted to know him better. And so I came back and I started reading the Quran in the English translation. And the more that I read the Quran, the more that I felt like God was connecting with me and I was connecting with him. I would go to school, and any of you who've gone to high school know that there is a lot of stuff you deal with in high school. It's really awkward. I wasn't awkward, but it is awkward to deal with being a high school student. And when I went to school and things would happen, I'd come home and open the Quran, and I felt like God was directly talking about my day, the struggles that I was facing. And I remember one time I was sitting and I was thinking, God, are you even listening to me? Are you out there? There are so many times that I'm sure many of you might have gone through this point where you might be wondering, is God even listening to me? He has so many other people to listen to. And I remember making that statement. And I closed my eyes and I opened the Quran and I pointed a random verse of the Quran for just any type of comfort. And the verse that I pointed to said, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِ فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. The verse literally says, when you ask about me, I am close. I'm answering the call of the one who's calling upon me. I was wondering if God is even listening to me, and he brought me to a verse that literally said, when you call upon me, I answer. And I just recited to you the Arabic verse. I was reading this book in English because I didn't understand Arabic. I'm not Arab. I studied in Egypt later on so that I could learn Arabic. But we believe that the Quran was revealed in Arabic from God through angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And we believe it's the final compilation of texts that God sent with Moses, like the Torah, Jesus, the Gospel, David, the Psalms, and other books that he sent through time. And that the Quran is a completion of those texts that share with us so many stories of Abraham or Jacob or Noah and how we can live our lives recognizing these prophets. And amongst them is the story of Virgin Mary. She is mentioned so many times in the Quran, including a chapter that's dedicated just for her, chapter 19. And the more that I read about her in the Quran, the more that I stopped wanting to be Britney Spears, God bless her, the more that I started wanting to be like my namesake, Virgin Mary. I would read about her and think, What was it like for her to be the first woman to enter a sacred space and hold that sacred space with the support of someone like Prophet Zechariah? What was it like for her to be accused of immoral action and yet to come with a baby, holding baby Christ, and he is speaking to people in infancy? What was it like for her as a mother to know that her son could cure the leper, heal the blind, bring back the dead, all by the sake of God's power? What was it like as a mother to see those things? The more that I read about her fortitude, the more that I wanted to become someone who embodied my name. And one of the ways that that embellished for me was wearing this head covering, wearing this hijab. Anytime we see a picture of Virgin Mary, she's covered. I wanted to honor that. And our faith tradition encourages both men and women with a specific code of modesty. You might have seen Muslim women covering their heads, covering our heads. We do this out of reverence for Virgin Mary, to be like someone who God states is the most honored woman in the entire world. And this isn't very different from the Jewish or Christian faith tradition. I was very blessed with going to Jerusalem a few years ago with my husband, and I couldn't tell who was Christian or Jewish or Muslim when they were women because we all dressed exactly the same. I could only tell when someone was Christian when she was wearing a cross over her clothing, or when a woman started walking and held her hand to someone who was wearing a yarmulke. And then I realized, oh, they're not even Muslim, but they look exactly like I do. And it was such an empowering moment for me to be connected with women of so many different faith traditions in our complete submission to our understanding of what could honor someone like Virgin Mary. I know that we hear of so many differences, especially today when it comes to our faith traditions. But I went to Jerusalem because I was studying Arabic in Egypt. And when I was in Egypt, it was the first time I also came across Arab Christians. I know here we seem like we're in different kind of faith spaces, but it was interesting to me to see an Arab country in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims all say Allah to refer to God. Allah in Arabic simply means God. Dios in Spanish means God. English we say God. Every language has a different name in which they celebrate our Creator. And Allah, which is the term that Muslims are familiar with in Arabic, is the same one that Christians and Jews use when their native tongue is Arabic. And these similarities are so many that unfortunately, when we are living in our country, which is often divisive, and some of the narratives we hear in the media or some of the structures in which we have in place, we sometimes forget how connected we are. I know that one of the biggest issues that we have right now when it comes to Islam, when you hear the word Islam, when you hear about Islam in the media, unfortunately, has to do with terror. And I know that any Muslim that I've met in my entire life, I'm 30, so that's a lot of Muslims. I traveled all around the world to give lectures to Muslims. I've been in touch with a lot of Muslims. And let me say that we are terrified and in so much pain when we hear about attacks taking place. The United States National Anti-Terrorism organization found that Muslims are actually 82 to 97% more likely to be victims of a terror attack. We are more likely as Muslims to be victims by individuals who claim our name of religion. And so we are afraid because we could be victims. We are afraid because we're victims of hate crimes. We are afraid because we know that people hear Islam, which means submission to God, this internal peaceful state of coming close to Him and feeling like you are one with your Creator and in serving the creation, that beautiful word could be associated with something like terror. And that's so harmful and hurtful for us because the Quran specifically states that if you harm one life unjustly, it's as if you've killed all of humankind. If you've killed a life unjustly, it's as if you've killed all of humankind. If you save one life, it's as if you've saved all of humankind. And that doesn't say this person has to be a believer, this person has to this person has to that, this person has to be male. No, any person who is killed unjustly, it's as if all of humankind was killed. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he was living in a city where people who were becoming Muslim because of his message were persecuted, were boycotted, were killed, his own family members were mutilated. When he was living this experience, those same people who were harming him in his community, he said about them that if they were to call him to do any type of social justice work, he would still work with them. Because it doesn't matter what someone might be doing to you or what someone may believe in if it's different from you, if the greater cause of working for a societal benefit is there. And that's one of the important messages for myself as a Muslim. When I look at the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his life was one which shared the critical nature of working with people to create rights, especially for the most vulnerable. He said that if there is a non-Muslim minority, that if anyone harms that minority, acts cruelly towards that minority, oppresses that minority, doesn't give the rights to that minority, then he himself would personally be against that person on the day of judgment. For us, that's an enormous statement. To personally have the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon you, witness against you means that restoring and supporting the rights of vulnerable communities is a priority for a Muslim. When we look at that message, I think that we can agree that regardless of where we stand on our faith, there is so much work that we can do here, whether it comes to human trafficking, whether it comes to the school-to-prison pipeline, gender inequality, whatever we are struggling with the systemic racism that we see, police brutality, there are so many areas that we can work together as faith communities to help create a more socially just globe, and especially for ourselves, a more socially just country, because this is directly where we can impact. I know that sometimes it's overwhelming to put yourself in a place where when you are going to work with someone else, you're not sure how it's going to be. You might not feel like you have the education or the knowledge or the experience to be that person who's creating this new space to help provide people with rights and work towards social justice. But that is where, for myself, I remind myself, as many of you may remember, the story of Moses, peace be upon him, where he had a speech impediment, and God told him to go to Pharaoh to protect the people of how we say it in Arabic, the Israelites, to help and protect this vulnerable group of people, to call Pharaoh to worship God directly and to stop his oppression. He was concerned with the way that people might view him because of his impediment, just like we're concerned about the way people may view us because of our age, our gender, the way we dress, something that no one knows that's internal, that no one is even aware of. Whatever that might be, we know what it's like to be in Moses' shoes. And he asked for his brother Aaron to come with him. And God sent Aaron with him to support him. And that's exactly an example of us. We need each other to support one another in this process of changing our globe to be a place where we want our children to love one another growing up and to feel safe and to feel comfortable. When they were afraid, God said to them, قال لا تخافا إنني معكما أسمع وأرى. Don't be afraid. I am with you, hearing and seeing. Whenever I am afraid, I think about that. That as long as I try my best to be in a space of working towards social justice, no matter what type of obstacles I face, God will be with the person, regardless of their faith, who tries to create a better place for everyone. And I truly am so grateful and humbled by your work here at Trinity Church and the people who've made time to come on a Sunday to an event like this. because you are exactly the type of person who makes me feel safe and who gives me the type of hope that despite the craziness that we see around the world, we can actually help create change because there's so much more good than bad. Thank you so much for having us. And also, side note, I'm wearing the same scarf as the flyer I was in. And I told my husband, he's over there, hi, Omer. I told him that everyone is going to notice that I'm wearing the same scarf, and everyone is going to say, oh, do you always wear that same scarf? And he was like, no one's going to think that. I'm like, don't mansplain this to me. I know they're all going to think this. So anyway, I do wear different scarves. It just happened that this is my outfit. Feel free to ask about that in the Q&A. All right, thank you. It just came out, that story.
Well, thank you all for your initial talks. We're going to jump into the dialogue. You all are being a great audience. You're being very attentive. Remember, you have those note cards. This is the time for our Q&A, and we'd love, I can run us through questions for the next hour, but we want your questions too. So please use those note cards, flag our runners, and we'll start hearing from all of you. And I want to invite the three of you, if you have questions for each other, to jump in with that as well. I think an interesting place to start, you've all mentioned that there are these dominant voices in our society and in our media that don't feel like they represent your experiences of your faith tradition. Matthew, you used the phrase, how can we reclaim the microphone? And so I'm wondering how each of you approach that. How do we bring tolerance up to the surface in our dominant cultures? How do we talk about our faiths as being faiths of tolerance and compassion and understanding? How might we do that work of reclaiming the microphone? Or how might you encourage those of us here to lift our voices up in our communities?
Well, I think part of it is that religion is a difficult conversation to have in the Bay Area. You know, we hear people all the time who say, outside of my own community, I don't know anyone who has a religious commitment. And I think part of what we need to be able to do is that those of us who have a religious commitment need to be able to be honest and open about that in ways that don't, scare people, but also in ways that make it clear that there are lots of different kinds of ways of being a person of faith. And that you can hold the faith that you hold in a very sophisticated sort of way. And if we can begin to get that message out, I think it begins to overcome the popular perception that religion isn't very sophisticated, or that it doesn't have a positive role in the world. I think a lot of people, particularly in North America, think that if we could just get rid of religion, the world would be fine, right? And we all know that that's not really true, but that's part of what's out there. So claiming a public voice that gets a different point of view out there is harder to do, but I think certainly being able to share individually that we are people of faith who don't look like that is a place to begin, at least.
I would also say that I think it's helpful when communities, religious communities, participate in civic life and in politics. It's always a little bit tricky as a religious organization to enter the political realm, and a lot of people don't like it, right? Because they want to leave politics outside the door. But I found that it's really powerful when, like for instance, our congregation has been involved in advocating for early childhood education, and have gone to lobby in Sacramento and have gone as a religious community, and it's been very positively received, and it's been very powerful to say we are a community of faith, and we're saying this is part of what it means to be Jewish, is to care about this issue and to work for this kind of justice. And so I think that the more that we can do that, the better.
I think also as individuals, making the decision to be actively involved in a center or a space that's not one like our own is critical, even if it's just taking a class at the gym, but it's a different type of gym than everyone who attends at your mosque or your synagogue or your church, and being able to personally experience those relationships over a period of time, I think really critically changes the way that we start seeing people who might look like they're other or who might feel like they're other in some way, because then they become part of our own community. And I know myself, I'm not Latina, but I went to an inner city high school because they had the International Baccalaureate program. And I had gone to a suburban middle school. And before I went to high school, all of my friends who at my middle school were Caucasian and very wealthy, were all like, you're gonna get stabbed, you're gonna get beat. And those are the stereotypes I went into school with. But going to school with such a variety of different ethnic minorities, and especially the Latino community, who is the majority of the students in my school, made me feel like I want to do everything I can to be a part of this community, to ally for this community. And I think that was a critical experience for me while I was also transitioning into believing in my faith. So as someone who does believe in a specific faith, if you're able to look at what your faith shares about, social justice and reaching out to other people, it's not about being a martyr or I'm sacrificing myself for the well-being of these people. This is also my community. I want great for this community because I am a part of this community, even if I'm technically not. So what can I do to invest in this community? Because when this community wins, I win as well.
Thank you. I know I see questions piling up, and we're going to get to those really quickly. I'm wondering maybe to hear some stories from you about how you have witnessed injustice towards other communities right now. And this was part of how we prompted the shaping of this conversation. What about these experiences are you seeing, especially over the last year? Sarah, you touched on this. In the last year, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism. What have you all noticed in the last year as the climate in our culture has changed, since all of this really feels like it's becoming more prominent and more known? What are you noticing in the world around us? What's changed?
I'll be the first to answer every time.
Do you have? Oh, go,
Please.
We're so polite.
For me, I feel like I'm struggling with the fact that there is such a rise of hate crimes towards the Jewish community, towards the Muslim community, and this is not a religious community, but the Black community, whether they identify as Muslim, Christian, Jewish, atheist, or any other religion, but as a racial community, as well as the Native American community, and what was recently happened with DAPL. There are so many conversations about women and women's rights right now. So I feel like right now there's just such a conversation about people who feel vulnerable and what we can do together, which makes me very hopeful, because despite the fact that there is so much hate, I was so worried about the Jewish community. Earlier this year, there were desecrated cemeteries. I just feel like historically we've seen the Holocaust happen, really. Like, why are we still here? And we see that type of hatred is also pointed towards other communities as well. So for me, right now, I just feel like seeing these things as a person of faith is giving me the opportunity to look at how I can support other communities, and it makes me feel like the struggles that I'm going through, I'm not alone in them. When I'm afraid because someone yells something out at me, or because I hear of a friend who was the target of a hate crime, or when recently, a few months ago, there was a teenager, God bless her, who was killed because she was wearing her headscarf. When I hear about those things and I'm scared, I then think about my Black brothers and sisters who are dealing with hearing about innocent children, men and women being killed, and that's a longer discussion. There might be differences of opinion on this issue, that's okay, but I just can't imagine what it's like to be afraid for your child's safety, and only because of your race. I think about the rights that women are looking at potentially being taken away from us, and what that looks like if you are a woman who is struggling with 2 jobs, who is under the poverty mark, and who already is dealing with so many stereotypes when it comes to being in that space economically. So thinking about things like that when we see them helps me feel like I'm not alone in the pain that I'm feeling, and although it might be incredibly terrifying, I'm also not alone in the fear that I'm feeling. And I know that other people, I hope, would be willing to stand with me as I'm trying my best to stand with them.
So as I said in my thing, but personality-wise, I'm not a demonstration kind of guy, right? And of course, I've grown up as a man and a white guy, and so I've never belonged to a community that is vulnerable. And so one day last year, I think it was last fall, I got a call from a woman who has come to church here a couple of times maybe. As she said, she would like to come to church here, but getting up on Sunday morning is just tough. So, and she said, I'm organizing a vigil for kindness in downtown Menlo Park, and I would like you to come and be a part of it. And I felt sort of like my stomach drop, because I'm like, okay, I just don't want to do this. But I don't have a good reason to say no. So I said yes. And then I got there and discovered that I was expected to lead the thing. And so we sort of took it from there. And of course, it's quite a remarkable thing, I suppose, a sign of the times perhaps that a group of people in Menlo Park would get together downtown and have any kind of vigil or demonstration of some kind. And then that vigil happened, and then people were so appreciative of the opportunity to do that. And some of the people there were part of vulnerable communities, and they were very appreciative of the fact that people would come out and do that. And that was followed by another one a few weeks later. And then we heard that there was going to be a demonstration. This was this past spring, I think, down in the border of Santa Clara and San Jose by a group that said that the purpose of their demonstration was simply to object to Sharia law or something like that. It was clearly meant to be an anti-Muslim demonstration, and they were clearly trying very hard not to call it that. And these were demonstrations that were supposed to happen all over the country. And so I found myself with a group of a few other people from Trinity in the library over here in our building making signs, protest signs, which I had never done before in my life. And we went down to San Jose, and the beautiful thing about it was that on the corner were these few people who were part of this anti-Muslim demonstration, and across the street were hundreds and hundreds of people from all different walks of life, from all different religious traditions, including us, who were sort of saying no to this other group of people.
Thank you. That's so beautiful.
So it was a beautiful moment. It was a beautiful moment, and it was a beautiful moment that sort of told me that the number of people who are willing to embrace others in our society is far larger than the number of people who want to demonize and do violence toward them. But I also realized something else in that moment, which is that if those of us who I think do represent the majority, who aren't interested in demonizing other people, if we don't show up, if we don't say something, then we will never know that. And so I think, we have an obligation to show up. And as you were saying, Sarah, that gets close to politics, and people who come to church or synagogue or mosque sometimes are like, we're not sure we want to get into politics. To me, it sort of goes beyond politics, and it's just sort of showing up in a human way to say, we don't support hatred and demonizing and victimization of other people. And that, to me, is not a political statement, it's a human statement. And also a statement of faith, in a way.
This isn't so much a question, but a comment that I'd love to hear some of your opinions on. I think it raises a question of how do we talk about this? this person raises the comment that can we please not have such a low bar of tolerance? Tolerance is something we do, as they say, we tolerate DMV lines and illnesses, but we talk about one another as though we're something to be tolerated. How do we raise the bar of the wider conversation? And I know, I've used that word, and so how do we, all of us, work again, reframe that conversation and move beyond tolerance?
Yeah, I've stopped using that word because I hate that word. Because tolerance means that someone's putting up with you, right? But that really they wish you weren't there. And I just think that's not going to get us anywhere. So I think we absolutely do have to raise the bar and stop talking about tolerance and start talking about understanding and acceptance and collaboration. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to be tolerated. Right? It doesn't sound like a very welcoming place to be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, but it's a place to start. Yeah. So I think the message that I hear is, tolerance is not where we want to end up. But at the very least, if we can, before we can appreciate or understand or celebrate that some people really do have to start with tolerance, unfortunately.
This is a question that they've asked each of you answer. If you could remove one stereotype of your faith, what would it be? Good question, whoever got that one.
I'll start.
Please.
I think the one that I would most like to get rid of is the notion that Jews are secretly controlling everything. Or I would say, if I can't remove it, I would like to be part of it.
So good.
But seriously, I do think that it is a long-standing and kind of, it pops up in strange ways with people who you would not consider to be anti-Semitic or prejudiced, but this notion that Jews have this power that is not deserved and that is sort of out of proportion to the community, and that we're sort of secretly controlling things and manipulating. I think it's insidious.
I think if I had to pick one, there are so many, but I think if I had to pick one, it would be the idea that one cannot be a Christian and be a scientist at the same time. Or more generally, that Christian belief is incompatible with modern science. That you can't be a Christian and accept the theory of evolution. Because I think that makes us into people who look like we're unthinking, unsophisticated people, and that's not who most and I don't know any Christians who are unable to accept the insights of science. So I think that's the one I would choose to jettison.
I literally ran through like 70 in my head. But the one that I landed on, because I feel like I've at least touched on most, the ones that came to my head most in the priority while I was doing the lecture, is that Muslim men are really, really gentle people. And I don't think we see that portrayal in the media. I've had the most beautiful experiences with men I've never met who treat me as their sister. My husband is the most I love you so much, the most incredible man I've ever met in my life. My dad, his entire motto growing up was, "You will because you're a woman." And I know that we have a lot of conversations nationally about men right now. I know the hashtag #MeToo was a national conversation we've had recently, which is so important, and it does apply to Muslims as well. But also, the stereotype you frequently see in the media is a man with a huge beard screaming, and there are many men with beautifully huge beards, and they're screaming because they're worried about the rights of the people who are being oppressed. and they're very beautiful people.
Another question about each of the three faiths for each of you to address. Within each of these traditions, there is at least a small sect of people who believe violence is an answer to solve problems. And the question this person's posed, and can be a broader conversation of, have you personally had to engage with anyone who holds that viewpoint in your tradition, and how do you engage that part of someone who's claiming part of the same tradition as yourself?
I've never, ever met a single person who has had that viewpoint. And I'm telling you, I've met people, Muslims, all around the world. We are as shocked and confused about where the heck these people are coming from as you are when you ask those types of questions. And a lot of times people say, what are these terrorists thinking? And I'm like, we have to find one and ask them, because I've never met someone who has ever supported that viewpoint. I've never had that conversation. The conversation I keep having is with Muslim children in elementary school who are bullied and called terrorists, and they're asking, what do I say back? And that breaks my heart.
Yeah, I've never met someone who had a Christian commitment and a commitment to violence at the same time. I think that part of dealing with that is to recognize that that is always a minority. In every religious tradition, the people who are willing to use that tradition to do violence are always a minority. I think we've let ourselves believe that in the case of Islam, it's a majority, which is simply not true. And I think that we have to recognize that religion is a powerful force, a powerful motivating force in the world. And very often it gets used as a convenient label for people who have other kinds of grievances. So the example I always like to use is the example of the conflict in Northern Ireland. It was often advertised as a conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but it never was. It was a conflict between people who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom and people who wanted to be part of the Republic of Ireland. It happened that the people who wanted to be part of the United Kingdom tended to be Protestant, and the people who wanted to be part of the Republic of Ireland happened to be Catholic. And so those religious commitments became convenient markers of other kinds of commitments. And I think that most religiously motivated violence is not motivated really by religion. It's motivated by some other kind of grievance or fear or something like that. And religion becomes a way you can catalyze people to become excited about that and join your cause. It can be a convenient marker to distinguish you from someone else. But I have read, I don't know if this is true, Miriam, but I have read that some of the folks who are terrorists and claim to that in a connection to Islam, often if you talk to them, they're very ignorant of much of what Islam has to say. So they're not super religious people in that sense. And the place I always come back to in terms of this sort of violence and its connection to religion is something that Parker Palmer, the author and teacher that many of you I'm sure have heard of, talks about in his book about how to rebuild a democracy. And he says that the thing we have to recognize is that everybody at some level is brokenhearted. And that brokenheartedness can easily lead to rage if it's not addressed. And if we're going to be able to sort of connect with each other, we have to be willing to connect at the level of our brokenheartedness. And to hear what other people's heartbreak is, and recognize that what breaks someone else's heart might not break mine, and what breaks my heart might give them joy. But if we can't hear each other's brokenheartedness, which is often what gives rise to rage, and that rage allows religion to become a tool to motivate violence, I think it's hard to have a conversation with each other. So I think the violence is, I think we have to be able to hear legitimate grievances that lie behind violence that claims to have a religious connection if we're going to try and overcome that.
Yeah, when you were saying that, I was reflecting on, I've not met very many Jews who, for whom violence is sort of a religious value. Although I would say the closest thing that I have come across is in Israel, and that the sort of Jewish commitment and is tied up with Israeli identity and is tied up in the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and that seems to be very separate from the way most American Jews think about Judaism, but that there is a sense that that violence in certain cases is justified and is necessary, and so it is very troubling. But what you were saying about being able to see the other side's brokenheartedness, I think is something that we haven't quite figured out in that part of the world.
Changing gears a little bit, we've been talking a lot about these three faiths, obviously, and talking in a general sense about being people of faith, and yet not everyone in the audience is a person of faith, whether agnostic or atheist. How do we begin to bridge this conversation, not just to be between people who share a faith in a monotheistic God, or share these texts with shared players, but bridge the conversation to be wider than being about people of these traditions, and also to other traditions outside of the three represented on the stage?
I can start on this one, because there are many Jews who don't believe in God, and some of my best friends are atheist Jews. So it's not a new thing for the Jewish community, at least, to be as wide and welcoming as possible. But I think it is a really important challenge to remember that we can still be committed to values, and we may have different sources for those values. But there's no rule that says you have to be a person of faith to believe in justice or to believe in equality. So to focus, I think, on values and just to focus on the source when it helps and when it's a powerful source, but to focus on what we can share.
Yeah, I think clearly there's lots of good people who don't have a religious commitment. I tend to think that all of us have some kind of spirituality, because I think that's kind of hardwired into being human, but how we live that out and express that can vary a lot from person to person. So as you were saying, Sarah, there's no reason why we can't have conversations that are sort of human conversations that don't have anything to do with religion around issues of justice and repair of the world and things of that nature, which we're all interested in. But I think to sort of flip the coin to the other side, it also, I think, means that people who don't have a religious commitment need to not be afraid of people who do. Because I think that sometimes people think, well, it's weird that you have a religious commitment, and I just don't know what to do with that. And in its worst forms, it's sort of like, you have a religious commitment, really? Are you a 21st century person? And so I think that there's all these little ways in which religious people belittle other people, but there's also ways in which religious people get belittled by other people because there's not a willingness to understand that commitment. And so that can lead to, and if religion were just gone, we wouldn't have all these problems, right? I ran across an interesting figure the other day, because I think we have this sense in North America that religion is on the decline. Europe and North America tend to share this perspective that religion is becoming less of a force in our societies, and in many ways it is. But if you look globally, over the next few decades, religion globally is expected to be a more and more powerful force. So the number of religious people globally is not declining, it's increasing. And that is contrary to our experience as North Americans. And so I think we also have to get we have to acknowledge that religion isn't going away. So we have to learn how to have these conversations with people who have a different set of commitments than we have in one sense, but who share a common commitment in another sense, which is that we want to live in a peaceful world where people have the rights that they need to have.
I'm part of a weekly group that gets together, and we do really fun things. And we're all different. There are women who are in their 70s, and they're white, and they are Jewish. And then there are women who are in their 20s, and they've recently come from India, and they identify as Hindu. And we have a wide, broad range of atheists and agnostics and Christians and everyone in between. And we have never had conversations about religion because we're so busy working and doing things with our hands and interacting with one another about your kids and how's life, and oh my gosh, there was this like crazy guy who said this thing to me at Starbucks, and we have like those conversations. And the only time we started talking about religion was a few months into our group. Ramadan came in, and so I was fasting, and I told them I'm going to be out for Ramadan. I brought some Ramadan cookies, and I was like, see you guys in a month. And they were like, you're Muslim? Like, what? And it was the first time they started having discussions with me about what faith means to me and started sharing discussions about their own faith. But by that point, I knew them so well for who they loved to follow on Twitter, or what their favorite thing to cook was, or when they got into a fight with their boyfriend. I knew about them as people without the politically charged discussions. And so we were able to have those types of discussions without any of the fear and the controversy. And I think that being able to see people for the things that give them so much passion and the things that cause them so much heartache is so critical, because when you're able to see people in that lens, you can start to see things like their faith or their not faith as something that's a huge important piece of them, but not the only thing that makes that person up. And I think being able to see that helps with having the more delicate conversations that sometimes we can't have with someone we've just met.
This question is directed at all of you. Most religions and our religious texts are true to this, have contradictions within them, and our traditions have contradictions in them. How do you choose what parts to believe in and what parts not to? How do you address the contradictions that exist within your faith or your sacred texts or your worship life?
Okay, it's the thing I feel very passionate about. Because the other thing I would jettison, if I could jettison a second stereotype of Christianity, it's that you have to read the Bible literally and believe every word of it exactly as it's written in order to be faithful. We as 21st century human beings have lost the capacity to be poets, except for the small minority of people who still study poetry. Starting in the late 19th century, or even late 18th century, with the rise of the scientific method, we started reading texts the way scientists read text, which meant that we started to equate truth with facts. So we read for information rather than reading for inspiration. Religious texts were not written in that climate. Religious texts were written centuries upon centuries ago when no one had heard of the scientific method, and those people did not read for facts. They did not read for information. They read for inspiration. And all religious texts are meant to proclaim something. They're all meant to say, I had this amazing experience of God, which I can't possibly describe to you, so let me try to describe it to you. Right? And so you're always having to use human language to talk about something that human language ultimately fails in the face of. And so the reality is, in the Christian tradition, when you look at the Bible, everyone picks and chooses. Even the people who insist that don't pick and choose are picking and choosing, right? And from the Christian tradition's point of view, we are to read the scriptures through the eyes of Jesus, which means that we look at what Jesus said and did, and we look at his life, and we look at all of the scripture that precedes that in light of that, a light of Jesus. And so if Jesus says A and something else in the Bible contradicts it, then we go with Jesus, right? We don't go with the other thing, right? Because you can't, scientists seek to find a theory of everything that will pull everything together, right? And maybe someday they will. There is no way you can pull everything in the Bible together in one coherent thing. You always have to pick and choose. And the question is, on what basis are you picking and choosing? And to me, when it comes to the Christian tradition, there is very much going on in that tradition. Jesus is looking at, are you going to interpret things through the lens of mercy and compassion, or are you going to interpret things in a legal sense? And he's basically saying, by the way, the right answer is you look at things through the lens of mercy and compassion. And so there are things in the Bible that are not merciful or compassionate. And they're not the things we're supposed to be focusing on. I'll wrap this up with one story. Many years ago, I was doing a private retreat at a Roman Catholic monastery in Georgia, near Atlanta. And the monks gather for prayer at like 4 o'clock in the morning for the first prayer service of the day. And they read the Bible all the way through at that service from one end to the other. Of course, they read not all at once, but they read little sections. But they go in order day after day after day, right? And it just so happened when we were there that they were in the middle of reading the book of Judges. Now, the book of Judges is a really difficult book because it's basically a story of people who are taking revenge on other people. And one of the monks came by where the guests were gathered, and he said, "I'm so sorry you're here while we're reading Judges." He said, "I keep telling the abbot that we shouldn't read Judges in church because there's just nothing to take away from it that's useful. And we can't change the Bible, but we can darn well decide what we're going to read out of it." And that gets us away from the idea that truth is only found in the Bible, and it helps us to recognize that truth is found somewhere else. For Christians, the Word of God for us par excellence is not found in a book. It is found in the person of Jesus. And everything in the book needs to be interpreted in light of the person that we are following. And so that's going to mean you're going to pick and choose. And it's going to mean that it's messy. But it should be messy. Because in the end, we all have to chew on it and figure out where it leads us to. So I'm sorry, I went on for a while. I feel very strongly about this topic.
Clearly. Sarah?
Yeah. Well, as a Reformed Jew, we have less trouble than other denominations of Judaism in picking and choosing. And I think that when it comes to the Bible, our approach is similar to what you're describing, but not exactly the same. So I think the Reform Jewish position would be we should read Judges because there's something to be learned from it. But it doesn't mean that we have to like it or agree with it or agree with the values. And again, I want to quote my teacher, Rachel Adler, who says, she's very poetic, she says that we're meant to wrestle the text for a blessing. And I love that because I think that's really true, that sometimes we're going to read things in the Bible that we love, that inspire, that speak to us. And sometimes we're going to read things that really challenge us, that repulse us. And there's something to be learned in both cases. So it's not always easy, but I think it's fruitful.
And this is something that I actually think the Christians can learn from the Jewish people. Because the Jewish people are very comfortable having multiple interpretations of a single text side by side on the page and just arguing about it.
That's true.
For centuries.
That's what we like to do.
Exactly.
That's true.
And Christians have had this obsession with saying, no, we can't have multiple interpretations. We need to arrive at one interpretation, label it true, and kill everybody else who doesn't agree with us. And that's just a wrong-headed way of going about it. So I think we would be very enriched by embracing the example of the tradition from which we came and saying it's okay to have all these competing interpretations lying there side by side. Because, as you said, it's in wrestling with those that we find our way together toward a deeper truth.
We have a very different understanding of our book. We believe that it's the direct word of God, and God doesn't make mistakes, and it's revealed to a man who wasn't literate and who couldn't write. He was unlettered. So when it was revealed, there are a number of passages that maybe didn't make sense then because they're in the middle of the desert. So, for example, the Quran talks about the ocean and how there is a salty part of the ocean and a sweet part of the ocean, and how there's a barrier that, like, I don't know if you've seen pictures of this, but there's a part of the ocean that literally you can see the salty part, and there's a barrier, and there's the sweet part. And none of these people had really been on boats before, so I mean, they just took that. There's verses in the Quran that talk about embryology and how the fetus is formed and the stages that it goes through and how it's created. And they took that because they believed it came from God, but we weren't able to understand those verses until we actually had science confirm what that actually looks like, or astronomy and the discussion about certain planets, or not planets, but the creation of the Earth or mountains, and there's the pegs that are underneath the mountains. Again, people who lived in the middle of the desert, they maybe knew some things, but this is like higher level science. And as science revealed those areas, that's when Muslims started understanding what the Quran was actually saying with those verses. So I think for us it's kind of been more of an evolution of understanding what some of the verses mean in a scientific way and just accepting them as we can understand them in our own colloquial way when we don't have that information. At the same time, I was really trying to think of a verse that might have some type of, we don't believe that a single verse in the Quran contradicts another, so I was really trying to think of maybe an example of this, but there is like a discussion of Moses asking to see God directly. And our understanding of God is that he is unlike anyone, that he's not in a human form, he's not in a form we can imagine, he's the creator of all things, and he's all-powerful and loving and strong, and he doesn't have the human attributes like he, I don't know, getting sick or getting tired or those types of things, because he's beyond that. So Moses asks to see him, and he's beyond our ability to see. And so when he asked to see him, the mountain crumbled. And that verse there's a discussion on another part of the Quran which references seeing God with your eyes. Well, that's not the exact phrase, but it's and we'll have more in paradise, which means we'll be able to see God. So the scholars are like, well, if Moses couldn't see God on earth, how are we going to see him in paradise? And then the way they bring that together is, well, earth and paradise are two different places, so the rules are a little bit different. So that's the type of contradiction discussion that we have, but it's not, I don't think it's in the same way that I'm hearing from other, I'm done. Yeah, period.
So one of these questions was directed at Miriam, but I actually think it'd be interesting to hear from all of our perspectives on it. It comes from a Christian woman asking, how could I attend a mosque service? How do I do that? And I think this could be a great opportunity for maybe each of you to speak to how could a visitor come into your tradition and experience you in a way that is reverent to your beliefs and allows them to come have an experience of what you do in each of your unique faith traditions. How would you welcome the stranger into your worship?
That is so beautiful. Thank you so much for the person who asked that. You and all of you are welcome anytime to come into a mosque and visit. Most mosques have a website and just have contact information, but I would be more than happy to personally go with you and just walk through the mosque itself and attend a service and answer any questions that you have. I'm on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also email me. I'm happy to meet with you afterwards and give you my personal information. But also, if you do just look up any mosque website and contact them, they definitely should be able to guide you into when you can walk in anytime you want. But you might not find a service, you might just find a building, and that's totally fine. You can still look around. But if you'd like to have a formal service, then someone can assist you with that.
Are different mosques going to have different traditions or practices that someone should be looking out for?
Not
if they're
really.
Going as a visitor?
The biggest thing is that different mosques are just physically shaped differently. There's a huge mosque in Santa Clara that was in an old HP building, so it just looks more like an HP building versus a new versus a new mosque, which is in San Jose, which kind of looks more like a mosque structure. So it's really just kind of like where the mosque kind of inhibited the space, or if they were creating their own. There's no really rules you should know. Generally, in visiting any worship space, I think people are asked to dress kind of conservatively. Some mosques ask that women cover their hair, but not all mosques ask that, and that's not a religious requirement. If you're coming to visit, there's a prayer area where we take off our shoes. So if you see shoes, maybe take your shoes off. But those are kind of the only rules that I can think of.
Very welcome to come to our congregation. Our main services on Friday evenings at 6:15. We also have Saturday morning services at 10:15 or 10:30. And I can't think of anything that you need to be warned about. Most of the service is sung, and most of it is in Hebrew, so that might be different. But we do have prayer books that have the Hebrew transliterated into English letters. So. And really, we try to be very welcoming to all sorts of people from all sorts of walks of life, people who are visiting or coming for a family celebration or just want to check it out. So if you have questions specifically about when you might come, please let me know.
Well, Episcopalians are always happy to welcome visitors. And I think we do that. Episcopalians have a funny attitude about welcoming visitors because Episcopalians have been known to be called in the past God's frozen chosen.
Oh,
which is a cruel
I've never
moniker.
heard that.
But it does have a certain basis of reality. I think not at Trinity so much, but at other places. Because we don't want to get in people's faces, right? So if you come, we're we want to respect the fact that you're here, but we don't want to ask you too many questions and get kind of in your face and make you afraid. So.
We don't have that problem.
So I would just say that attending an Episcopal service, if you've not done so, if you've been to a Catholic service or a Lutheran service or something like that, it'll be relatively familiar to you. If not, it will be unfamiliar, and I think you just have to be willing to sit in the unfamiliarity and join in where you can join in, and feel free not to join in whatever feels uncomfortable. I always think it's unfortunate if people come to a particular community only one time, because it takes time to get to know a place and to sort of get in touch with the rhythms of that place. And so I think, people should visit often to sort of get a sense of any place, regardless of the tradition.
Well, I think it's beautiful to hear such a welcome to the outsiders, and not even someone seeking to change faiths, but just to explore. We don't always get that sort of explicit invitation.
Oh no, did I not say I secretly want you all to convert to us? I'm just kidding.
Left that out. Unfortunately, I have stacks of questions here, and I think people can find you afterwards and ask you lots of questions. I wanted to end with one that came up a couple times where people asked that the three of you maybe brainstorm for a moment with each other about what do we do next? What's the next step in how not just these three faith traditions, there are some specific questions about that, but all the faith traditions or agnostics or atheists, how do we take this conversation and move forward, especially in the Bay Area? into better relationships with one another and working against the intolerance and injustice that has been existing. What do you want to see happen next?
Well, I think Trinity arrived at wanting to do interfaith work. That sort of came up in a very general way as part of a planning process we did a couple of years ago. And so we had a wonderful group of people who got together to sort of say, well, what does that actually mean? And we ended up, for this year, which started this fall and continues through the spring, saying we want to focus our attention on learning more about Islam, because they were the community that seemed to be right in front of us that was having the hardest time in terms of feeling vulnerable at this point in time, and that perhaps was the most misunderstood of the communities around us. And so we're very focused on this year on sort of learning about Islam to dispel our own stereotypes, and but that needs to lead into relationship, right? So we need to sort of, it's all fine to study things, but we then need to sort of proceed into actually forming relationships and partnerships with other communities so that we bring people of different traditions together. So we've been focused very much on doing that with Islam, but I think we can do that all over the map, right? I think it comes down to people of goodwill from different traditions being willing to come together and say, and get to know each other in a very human way, and then out of that sort of to say, what can we do to make the world a better place, to make the world a more just place? And so those are conversations that lead to specific plans, I think, that have to happen. The thing is, we have to be intentional about having those conversations and moving forward with them. It's not something you do in a year or two, I think. It's a long-term strategy.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think that's enough. But I also think that that it takes being involved. I'm going to say this again. I already said it, but being involved politically and making our voices heard and making those signs and going to those protests, even if we don't want to, and finding more ways to stand up for the rights of others. And again, it's not a short-term problem. It's going to take a lot of work day in and day out. And so we're going to need to be marathon runners rather than sprinters.
Mm-hmm. First, that was just a joke, what I just said. So, I'm really hoping that will Okay, second is I think the biggest thing is sometimes shifting just our paradigm. And I've really been working on this because I do get stared at a lot. And it's taken me a long time to, well, A, it's okay if you stare. I look very different. And I mean, obviously, I look amazing, so you'd want to look. But the second thing is just really, it's normal to try to understand why someone is dressed differently or why they look that way, but that's not necessarily why someone might be looking. Maybe they're just staring off in my direction and they have a headache. Or maybe, one time I was on a train and there were no seats except for this one that I had to climb over someone to sit in. And I kind of asked her if I could sit there, and she looked up at me. She was like, okay. So I was like, oh no, does she think I'm oppressed? Does she think I'm involved in something? Is she thinking about, I don't know what she's thinking about. So I sit down and I thought about it for a second and I was like, just reach out and say hi to her. Maybe it has nothing to do with you. Even if it does, you can change her opinion, I hope. So then I went and I asked her how she's doing, and then she said that she's doing very poorly because she's on the way to her best friend's funeral. And it had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with her best friend who had just passed away. And we prayed together, and we cried together, and we hugged together. And that moment would not have happened if I sat in my mind and thought this person hates me because of what they think I'm about. And I think that if you are not ready to be in a space where you're actively working on organizing, which is so important, and I cannot say this enough to Trinity, thank you so much for inviting us into these spaces. Thank you so much for the words that you've said, Rabbi Sarah, and thank you all for choosing to be in a space like this. That's huge. But not everyone's ready for that, and I think just reframing the way that we interact with people on a day-to-day basis really shifts the way that other people feel about who they are and what they believe in and how they're perceived as whether or not they belong here. And belong here is not the right word, as whether or not they are part of a greater community. One thing that I will say is I frequently am asked questions like, oh, where are you from? Or, oh, your English is so good. And, or this is like, I know this is meant sweetly. I know when they say, someone will say something like, oh, welcome, it's so great to have you as part of our country. And I'm like, bro, welcome to you too. Like, it's not helpful to make the assumption that just because someone doesn't look like you, they're not American as well. And I think that's really painful because we were founded through the slaughter of a lot of innocent individuals who were Native American. But many years, now we are trying to be a unified country. I'm just going to stop. I think I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop and say thank you. Oh, I'm just going to stop. Just stop.
It's like, so that I think finding the words is a lifelong journey.
Yes, it's a long journey.
It's a lifelong journey.
Your English is really good.
Thank you. You got that. Yeah, thanks, Matthew.
Final thoughts, if you have them, if you don't think you should share them, it's really, but our conversation is directed by these Q&As, and if there's anything that you've wanted to address or haven't gotten to say or want to reframe something you said previously.
Why are you looking at me?
Anyone. But final thoughts from any of you before we move into our blessings and our next steps.
Oh my gosh, okay. Can I just say that Muslims believe that whether you are struggling with addiction, or if you have tried to commit suicide, or if you're struggling with your sexual identity, if you are struggling with your marriage, if you're struggling with whether or not you even believe in God, that we believe that no one is not lovable to God, that God loves you in whatever state you are in, as long as you want to try somehow to have some sort of relationship with Him, He's running towards you. And I want to end with that because that motto or that understanding of who God is has helped me through some of the darkest times of my life, and it's helped me through some of the most painful parts of feeling like an unwanted outsider so many times in my own home. And I hope that when you see a Muslim, you'll think of someone who may not talk to you because they're just shy, or may have no idea how to say words on stage, but that we are people who are struggling to find our relationship with God as much as you might be. And if you don't believe in God, then we're struggling as much as you might be to pay the bills, or to have a great time with your family, or to help create a more just society. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all so much for coming to this program and to Trinity for inviting us. One of my favorite blessings. So in Judaism, there are blessings for everything. You say a blessing when you wake up. You say a blessing when you wash your hands. You say a blessing after you go to the bathroom. You say a blessing. I kid you not. But one of my favorite blessings is basically says, "Blessed are you, Eternal One, who has created creatures differently, who has created diversity." And the ancient rabbis came up with this, and it's a very ancient but also modern idea that we don't just tolerate, we appreciate and we celebrate the diversity of creation.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
So one of the heroes of our tradition as Episcopalians is Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was Archbishop in South Africa of the Anglican Church there, which is part of our family of churches. And as you know, he went through the whole apartheid thing and was very much a part of that struggle to bring that system to an end. And he was asked in his retirement, so this is not all that long ago, a few years ago, he was asked whether he was optimistic about the world. And he said, no, I'm not optimistic. But he said, as a Christian, I am required to be hopeful. So I have hope because that is the only way that I can live. And all of you being here today, and Sarah and Miriam, you being here today, is tremendously hopeful. And I think we all live in a time right now where being optimistic is really hard sometimes. But it's okay not to be optimistic, but it's not okay to not be hopeful. And so whatever you take away from being here today, I hope you could at least take away the idea that because of people like you all, who are willing to give of a Sunday afternoon to come and have this conversation, there is reason to be hopeful, and that you can take that hopefulness with you out into the world.
Thank you. Miriam, do you want to introduce our blessings?
As we close, we'd like to thank you all for being a part of this important conversation, and also ask God to bless us in our lives and in our journeys to come. We are going to close with a very similar statement that all three faith traditions have in terms of asking for God's blessings. And the Quran is going to read a few different passages that kind of embody some of the blessings that Reverend Matthew and Rabbi Sarah are going to end with. You can find the translation on the first page of your program. الله نور السماوات والأرض يريد الله بكم اليسر يريد الله أن يخفف عنكم لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها ادعوني أستجب لكم فقل حسبي الله لا إله إلا هو عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم.
This is known as the priestly benediction from the book of Numbers. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichuneka Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom.
So I'm going to be the least cool of these three blessings. But we deliberately chose the same blessing that Sarah just used, slightly different translation, to recall the fact that these traditions have a linkage together, and that we as Christians share our heritage with the Jewish people, and that Jesus himself was actually never a Christian, but always a Jew. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.
Amen. Thank you.
So I do my closing. So I have been given the task of closing. I want to thank you again so much for being with us. We can make our way to Trinity Hall. Is that what it's called?
Yes.
That way, where there are snacks and also a resource fair. So those of you who are asking about what next steps we might take, hopefully you'll find some information of some wonderful organizations that are doing important interfaith work to inspire your next steps. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.